The Book of Revelation often conjures images of cataclysmic events, the four horsemen galloping across desolate landscapes, ominous meteors streaking through the sky, and the cryptic mark of the beast. This popular, often sensationalized portrayal has deeply embedded itself in modern consciousness, shaping a widespread perception of the apocalypse as a literal, terrifying roadmap to the end of the world. Yet, this common understanding frequently represents only a superficial engagement with a text far richer and more complex than typically imagined. The widespread public obsession and occasional misuse of Revelation's themes, particularly during global crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic, where its imagery is frequently invoked to explain current events, underscores a significant gap between popular perception and academic understanding. This report seeks to bridge that gap, inviting a deeper exploration into the Book of Revelation's profound truths and enduring relevance. The Book of Revelation, also known as the Apocalypse of John, stands as the final and arguably most misunderstood book of the Christian Bible. Its very title, derived from the Greek word apocalypsis, means unveiling or revelation. This term signifies a disclosure of divine mysteries, indicating that the book's primary purpose extends far beyond merely predicting future destruction. Instead, it offers a powerful message of hope, justice, and ultimate redemption, aiming to unveil profound truths about God's sovereignty and ultimate triumph over evil. The text emphasizes God's commitment to making all things new, rather than abandoning creation, presenting a vision of restoration that challenges common misconceptions about divine wrath. Crucially, understanding Revelation requires recognizing its unique literary genre. It is not a straightforward historical account or a literal prophecy in the modern sense, but a sophisticated blend of three distinct forms: an epistolary work, a letter addressed to specific churches, a prophetic text, both foretelling future events and forthtelling divine messages for the present, and most notably, apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature is characterized by its vivid, often extravagant symbolism, drawing heavily from earlier Old Testament texts such as Daniel, Ezekiel, and Zechariah. This symbolic language is intentional, designed to communicate profound spiritual realities rather than literal events or figures. The enduring significance of Revelation lies in its timeless themes, which continue to resonate and influence contemporary thought, culture, politics, and individual lives. Far from being a mere historical artifact, it serves as an indispensable resource for Christians seeking to understand their place in the modern world and the Church's ongoing role in secular society. Its nature as a performative text, a narrative intended to be recalled and reenacted, means that past events, such as Jesus' death and the struggles of the early Church, are made present through recollection or anamnesis. This process imbues current experiences with renewed significance and encourages active Christian discipleship. The Book of Revelation emerged from a specific historical crucible, deeply rooted in the experiences of its original audience. The author, identifying himself simply as John, wrote from exile on the island of Patmos, addressing 7 real Christian communities located in Asia Minor, a region corresponding to modern-day Turkey. These early Christians faced a profound crisis, ruthless persecution at the hands of Roman authorities. The book's symbolic depiction of the harlot Babylon is widely understood to represent pagan Rome, the imperial power built on 7 hills that was actively oppressing Christian believers. This context firmly establishes Revelation as wartime literature, a document crafted to provide hope and encouragement during a period of intense tribulation. The pervasive symbolism within Revelation served a critical, practical purpose for its original audience. The text explicitly states its symbolic nature, with John intentionally choosing the Greek word shmai.w, meaning to symbolize or communicate by signs, over a more general term like gunnery zw, to make known. This deliberate linguistic choice, reinforced by its parallelism with sho, de knumi, which consistently introduces symbolic visions throughout the book, indicates that the symbolism was not merely a literary flourish. Had the book been a literal, overt critique of the Roman Empire, its message would have been easily deciphered by Roman authorities, placing the already persecuted Christian communities at even greater risk. Therefore, the symbolism functioned as a divine code or a form of underground resistance literature. It allowed John to convey messages of hope, judgment against oppressors, and calls to unwavering faithfulness to his beleaguered audience, who, being familiar with Old Testament allusions and apocalyptic conventions, could understand it, while remaining largely obscure or dismissible to their Roman persecutors. This hidden communication strategy provided a powerful yet safe means of encouragement and ideological resistance against an overwhelming imperial power. John's primary objective in writing Revelation was to exhort Christians to stand firm in the faith and to avoid compromise with paganism, even when faced with severe adversity and the threat of martyrdom. The book offered profound comfort amidst suffering, reminding believers of Jesus' enduring promise, "Behold, I am with you always, until the end of the age." It served as a vital source of hope and encouragement during a time of intense persecution. Jesus' call to the churches to achieve victory through faithfulness, by which they will conquer and receive a reward, presents a revolutionary concept of triumph. This victory is not achieved by military might or by killing their enemies, but profoundly by suffering and bearing witness like the Lamb. This redefinition of conquering emphasizes a radical, non-violent form of resistance and spiritual victory that would have been deeply countercultural in the Roman Empire, shifting the focus from earthly power dynamics to divine sovereignty and the transformative power of self-sacrificial love. Furthermore, Revelation functioned as a powerful tool for social criticism, providing a main model of explicit social criticism in the New Testament. It directly challenged the Roman Empire's oppressive power structures and exposed the maldistribution of wealth that fueled social unrest in Asia Minor. The core themes of Revelation revolve around God's sovereignty and the ultimate victory of Jesus Christ. Scholars identify 10 major themes: God, worship, the people of God, the Holy Spirit, our enemies, the mission, Jesus Christ, judgment, the new creation, and perseverance. Central to these themes is the pivotal symbol of Jesus as the slain Lamb. His crucifixion is presented not as a defeat, but as his enthronement and the means by which he conquers evil and redeems humanity. The book also highlights the hope of Jesus' final return, the importance of faithfulness to Jesus throughout one's life, and the comfort of Jesus in suffering and persecution. A profound theological assertion within the text is that God is the sovereign Lord of history, implying that even the forces of evil unwittingly carry out the divine plan. This perspective provides a sense of assured victory, portraying the ultimate triumph of Christ and his followers over Satan as already over, even as it continues to unfold in history. The book culminates in the promise of a new heaven and a new earth, where God dwells directly with humanity, signifying a profound renewal and redemption of creation, rather than its abandonment. Revelation's primary mode of communication is its rich and complex symbolic imagery and numbers, almost all of which are deeply rooted in the Old Testament. The multifaceted purpose of this symbolism is critical for its interpretation. Firstly, it allowed John to express things he could not put into words, translating transcendental and spiritual experiences into visual metaphors. Secondly, the extensive use of Old Testament imagery fostered continuity with ancient prophecies, demonstrating a consistent divine message across biblical history. Thirdly, the symbolism was designed to encourage diligent readers to dig deeper for richer spiritual truths, making the message more profound for those who invested the effort. Furthermore, like Old Testament prophets, John employed symbolism for prophetic communication and judgment, aiming to shock genuine believers out of spiritual complacency and to judge the unrepentant. The recurring hearing formula, "He who has ears, let him hear," emphasizes that this symbolic language serves to blind and deafen the hardened while revealing truth to the faithful remnant. Finally, the symbols helped readers perceive spiritual reality concretely, transforming abstract concepts into impactful, tangible visions that shock us back into the reality of our relationship with God. To aid in understanding this intricate symbolic language, a table of key symbols and their scholarly interpretations is provided below. This resource is essential for demystifying the book, as grasping the original symbolic intent is foundational to tracing Revelation's influence on contemporary thought and culture. Without this interpretive key, audiences might revert to literal interpretations, thereby missing the profound, multi-layered implications of the text. The rich symbolism and complex narrative structure of Revelation have, over 2 millennia, given rise to a wide variety of interpretive approaches. These diverse views often stem from differing assumptions about the timing and nature of the prophecy's fulfillment. Understanding these distinct hermeneutical frameworks is essential for appreciating the book's multifaceted impact throughout history and in contemporary society. The four main interpretive views are the preterist, historicist, idealist, and futurist. The preterist view posits that most of Revelation's events were fulfilled in the first centuries of the Christian era, particularly in relation to the struggles of the early church and the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Proponents of this view emphasize that Revelation's frequent use of terms like must soon take place points to an immediate relevance for its original audience. They identify the symbolic Babylon not with a future global power, but with first-century Jerusalem, citing textual connections to the city where also their Lord was crucified and where prophets were killed. Furthermore, the 3.5-year period, alternatively expressed as 42 months or 1,260 days, is often correlated with the exact time frame of the Jewish-Roman War, which culminated in the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. The strength of the preterist view lies in its recognition of the book's immediate historical context and its direct relevance to its original readers. However, a consistent preterist reading can render the book largely irrelevant to the present struggles of the Church or its future expectations of God's promises. The historicist view interprets Revelation as a panoramic unfolding of church history, spanning from the apostolic era to the end of time. Adherents of this approach believe that the events described in Revelation progressively unfold throughout the course of Christian history. They often attempt to identify specific historical events or figures with the book's symbols. For example, a prominent feature of the historicist view, particularly among Protestant reformers, was the identification of the papacy as the Antichrist, seeing papal claims of authority over both church and state as fulfilling biblical indicators. The 7 churches of Revelation are often interpreted as representing 7 successive ages of the Church, from the Apostolic Age to the modern era. The strength of historicism lies in its acknowledgement that Revelation's visions refer to events that have occurred throughout church history. A criticism, however, is its tendency to assume a simple chronological sequence of events rather than recognizing that John might be presenting different perspectives of the same period. It has also been noted that this view can be myopic, often focusing predominantly on European and American church history. The idealist or symbolic view, also known as the spiritual or allegorical approach, interprets Revelation as a timeless portrayal of the cosmic struggle between good and evil. This perspective focuses on conveying universal spiritual truths relevant to believers in every age, rather than identifying specific historical events or figures. Idealist interpreters emphasize the great principles and the concept of daily spiritual warfare that the book illustrates. This approach is particularly well-suited for devotional application, as it allows readers to extract principles for Christian living from each scene without being constrained by historical or prophetic details. Unlike the preterist and futurist views, which are often mutually exclusive, the idealist approach can be seen as complementary, allowing interpreters to adopt elements from other frameworks while prioritizing the macro-level spiritual lessons. A common criticism, however, is that without a consistent code for unlocking its symbols, this approach can lead to highly varied and subjective interpretations. This view is adopted by Roman Catholicism and some liberal mainline Protestant denominations. The futurist view is the most popular interpretation in contemporary Western Christianity, particularly among modern evangelical churches. This approach understands most of Revelation, as in from chapter 4 onwards, as speaking prophetically about events that are yet to take place in the future, from both John's first-century perspective and the present-day reader's viewpoint. Futurist interpreters often see Revelation 1:19 as a chronological outline, with chapters 1 through 3 referring to the past and present, and chapters 4 through 22 describing future events. They typically interpret the events literally, such as a literal scroll, 144,000 individuals, and actual living monsters for the beasts. Key tenets include a literal rapture of the church, a 7-year period of tribulation, and a literal 1,000-year or millennial reign of Christ on earth. The strength of this view lies in providing a clear, linear roadmap for end times events. However, a common question raised is how a book, if most of it has not yet happened, could have benefited the church for the past 2 millennia. A strictly literal interpretation of the Book of Revelation faces significant academic criticism, with scholars widely asserting that such a reading is impossible and neither possible nor desirable. This critical stance is rooted in several key considerations. Firstly, a literal approach fundamentally misunderstands Revelation's literary genre. As previously discussed, Revelation belongs to apocalyptic literature, a genre inherently characterized by its use of symbolic imagery, dreams, and visions, rather than straightforward historical descriptions. To interpret a passage like Revelation 12 verses 3 and 4, which describes a giant red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, literally would lead to absurd or dangerous conclusions and fundamentally misreads the text. The book's imagery is designed to convey spiritual realities and theological truths through powerful, often fantastical pictures, not to be taken as a literal report of physical phenomena. Secondly, a purely literal approach often fails to account for the cultural context in which the Bible was written. It erroneously assumes that modern readers would understand ancient texts in the same way their original audiences did, overlooking the nuances of ancient metaphorical language and cultural conventions. For example, Psalm 18 verse 2 states, "The Lord is my rock," a metaphor for God's strength, not a literal geological description, a distinction ancient Israelites would have readily understood. Applying a wooden literalism to Revelation ignores these foundational principles of biblical interpretation. Thirdly, internal inconsistencies within Revelation itself pose challenges for a strictly literal reading. For instance, the text mentions a specific number of 144,000 people sealed from the 12 tribes of Israel, yet later refers to a great multitude that no one could count. Reconciling such apparent contradictions requires recognizing the symbolic and metaphorical nature of the numbers and descriptions, rather than insisting on a literal headcount. Finally, and perhaps most critically, overly literal interpretations can lead to problematic or even harmful ethical implications. If taken literally, Revelation's portrayal of God's wrath can appear horrible, depicting a ruthless tyrant who desires to torture everyone who does not believe in Jesus. This bloodthirsty narrative can be used to justify violence and exclusion, fostering a binary thinking that paints opponents in stark, often violent terms of good against evil. Such interpretations directly contradict modern sensibilities valuing dialogue, understanding, and a benevolent divine nature. The very design of Revelation, when removed from its original context and interpretive keys, inadvertently becomes a source of confusion and divergent interpretations. This underscores the importance of hermeneutics and historical critical methods for unlocking its meaning today. The Book of Revelation, despite its ancient origins and complex symbolism, continues to exert a profound and multifaceted influence on modern society. Its themes and imagery, really permeate various aspects of contemporary life, from political ideologies to cultural expressions, demonstrating its enduring power to shape human thought and action. As resistance literature, Revelation has historically served as a potent tool for social criticism, used to reflect on and challenge political structures and institutions across centuries. It provided a foundational model of explicit social criticism in the New Testament, particularly evident in its critique of the Roman Empire, which it symbolically equated with Babylon. This historical function highlights how religious texts can be mobilized for real-world power struggles. The book's themes of divine justice and retribution have inspired significant social justice movements. For instance, its imagery resonated with abolitionists like John Brown and influenced Julia Ward Howe's Battle Hymn of the Republic. Martin Luther King Jr. famously echoed its structure and language in his speeches, drawing on its vision of a new, just world to fuel the civil rights movement. For the oppressed, Revelation has functioned as underground resistance literature, offering hope and a framework for understanding and challenging overwhelming power structures. However, the political utility of Revelation presents a notable paradox. While the book's core message is about justice and God's sovereignty, its symbolic and open-ended nature allows for highly subjective application. This means that the same text can be appropriated by people on both sides of a conflict. For example, during the American Civil War, both Northerners and Southerners invoked Revelation, seeing the conflict as a divine judgment or the Battle of Armageddon. This illustrates that while the book can be a force for liberation, it can also become a tool for demonizing the other, underscoring the critical importance of interpretive principles. A prominent contemporary example of Revelation's political influence is the Left Behind phenomenon. This series of novels and films based on a futurist, literal interpretation of Revelation posits a literal rapture, a 7-year tribulation, and the Battle of Armageddon. This movement has significantly influenced contemporary political thought and an activist political agenda, particularly regarding U.S. foreign policy on Israel. Proponents often interpret events like the establishment of the Jewish state in 1948 and the recapture of Jerusalem in 1967 as direct signs of the imminent end, preparing for the rebuilding of the Jewish temple and Christ's return. This interpretation, however, has disconcerting aspects, including an unconditional support for Israel that often shows little awareness of political complexities or concern for the fate of Palestinians, and an embrace of violence as an integral part of God's divine plan. This view can also fuel cultural wars by identifying evil everywhere, including international bodies like the United Nations, and promoting a pessimistic outlook on existing societal structures. The Book of Revelation's vision of a new heaven and a new earth, as described in chapters 21 and 22, really shapes Christian environmental ethics. But its interpretation often leads to, pretty divergent views on how humans should treat the planet. While some folks have used this prophecy to justify exploiting the current Earth, basically arguing that it will be replaced and so doesn't need conservation, more and more scholars and theologians are emphasizing renewal rather than replacement. The idea here is that God does not make all new things, but all things new, which, implies a restoration of creation rather than its abandonment. This renewed understanding compels an ethic of environmental justice, promoting both human justice and the well-being of God's entire creation. Christians are called to be protective stewards of planet Earth, which means engaging in conservation efforts, reducing pollution, and advocating for ethical environmental policies. The belief that creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay, as it says in Romans chapter 8, verse 21, motivates believers to act now, honoring God's design and reflecting His future intentions through sustainable practices. However, the relationship between end-times beliefs and environmental action is, honestly, pretty complex and often contradictory. Some interpretations of eschatology, especially those linked to dispensational premillennialism, are associated with lower support for climate action. This perspective suggests that if the Earth is destined for destruction, there's little point in trying to conserve it now. This phenomenon, where a shorter time horizon or belief in an imminent end undercuts the willingness to incur short-term costs for long-term environmental benefits, really shows a direct causal link between theological belief and practical ethics. On the other hand, other interpretations of eschatology actually motivate environmental advocacy and sustainable living as central to God's plan for creation, viewing environmental responsibility as a continuous duty right up until the ultimate renewal. So this all highlights a pretty critical internal tension within Christian interpretations of Revelation, where the exact same text can lead to totally opposing views on environmental responsibility. Apocalyptic beliefs, especially those found in Revelation, have a really deep psychological impact on both individuals and communities, serving as a source of hope, but also, at times, as a trigger for anxiety. These narratives give people a powerful way to understand and cope with adversity, offering solace and instilling a sense of purpose, meaning, and trust in a higher guiding power during times of uncertainty and crisis. They can foster hopes for survival and renewal, which, helps folks navigate overwhelming challenges. Research even shows that engaging with media centered on apocalyptic themes can be linked to greater psychological resilience and preparedness during crises like the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the same narratives, when taken with extreme fervor or literalism, can trigger tangible fears linked to catastrophic events. They can contribute to negative psychological states like paranoia, cynicism, conspiracy mentality, and this really fatalistic and cynical view of the world. In some extreme cases, especially within fringe groups or cults, apocalyptic rhetoric becomes a powerful tool for leaders to consolidate power, foster intense group cohesion, and tragically, even justify extreme actions, including mass killing or collective suicide, as a way to either escape life's disappointments or provoke a desired end. This all shows that it's really the interpretation and application of these narratives, not the narratives themselves, that dictate their psychological and social impact. Community resilience, while it's built through collective action and social networks, can also be shaped by shared and sometimes isolating beliefs. The imagery of Revelation taps into some of our most fundamental anxieties about control, chaos, and the future, and how it's interpreted significantly shapes both individual and collective ways of coping, for better or worse. Beyond, its theological and social implications, Revelation has turned out to be an incredibly influential text in the world of culture and the arts. Its vivid, often dark and violent imagery has stirred the imagination of not only exegetes and theologians, but also writers, poets, and artists for centuries. The symbolic language really lends itself to reuse and reinterpretation across all sorts of media. In visual arts, Revelation has inspired countless works, from medieval illuminated manuscripts like the Cloisters Apocalypse and the Bamberg Apocalypse to those iconic woodcuts by Albrecht Dürer, like his famous Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Painters such as Hieronymus Bosch, with St. John on Patmos, El Greco, with the Vision of St. John, and William Blake with his Great Red Dragon series, have all turned its fantastical visions into masterpieces that continue to endure. Michelangelo's monumental The Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel also draws heavily from Revelation's eschatological themes. In film and television, Revelation's prophecies have served as direct inspiration or as kind of a thematic undercurrent for a lot of productions. The Left Behind film series, for example, is a direct adaptation of a literalist interpretation of the rapture and tribulation. Other films like The Omen, with its Antichrist themes I Am Legend, with its post-apocalyptic plague, War of the Worlds, Blade Runner, and The Road all draw heavily on Revelation's imagery and narrative structures. One interesting trend in modern secular films is how apocalyptic themes get recontextualized, often shifting the agency from divine intervention to human action, people trying to avert or survive catastrophe on their own. This really shows how powerful religious narratives can transcend their original theological intent and become cultural archetypes, with apocalypse now serving as a secular trope for all sorts of societal anxieties, like nuclear war, climate change, or pandemics. Music, too, has been profoundly shaped by Revelation. Its themes show up in traditional hymns and classical works, such as Handel's Messiah, which features the iconic "Worthy is the Lamb that was slain" and Hallelujah chorus straight from Revelation. Olivier Messiaen's Quatuor pour la fin du temps, or Quartet for the End of Time, draws inspiration from Revelation chapter 10, verse 6. Beyond classical music, Revelation's dark and violent imagery has found a particularly fitting home in heavy metal. Bands like Iron Maiden with The Number of the Beast, Metallica with The Four Horsemen, Megadeth with Blessed Be the Dead, and Testament with Seven Seals have all directly adapted or alluded to its verses, shaping both their lyrics and their sound. So this widespread cultural presence means Revelation influences even those who've never actually read the Bible, simply through its afterlife in art and media. The Book of Revelation stands not as a static, literal blueprint for a predetermined future, but as a dynamic, multi-layered text whose meaning has been continuously interpreted and reinterpreted across centuries.